Well, I think one of the things that I really took away from this book, which was very wonderful, by the way, and you don't say this explicitly, but I feel like the thing that I took away the most was that women in the Senate use their gender when it behooves them and shy away from it when it doesn't. Is that one of the points that you were trying to make with this book, or what is it that you want people to take away?
Well, I do think that is partially true, but when women came into the Senate, most people don't realize that there were very few women in the Senate up until 1990s. Up until 1990, you have only 2 women in the Senate. So all of those male senators don't know what to do with women coming into the Senate. And you have women coming in at the same time as you have a very big shift in Washington in terms of behavior in Washington becoming more partisan and more polarized. Mm-hmm. So as women come into the Senate, you're also in a much more partisan and polarized environment, and that's had a lot of effects. So in terms of utilizing their gender, they do emphasize it if it helps them to achieve their political goals.
Right.
And they de-emphasize it when they're concerned that it could hurt their political goals. So if we take the very obvious example of Hillary Clinton.
Right. I love that example. You talk about her a lot.
One of the reasons that she goes on armed services in the first place, because there had not been a senator from New York on armed services in a very long time, mm-hmm. was because she knew that she was going to be running for president and that as a woman she needed to establish her credentials. And she spent time talking to military officials, establishing herself with flag officers, talking to other people on the committee, co-sponsoring bills, and she actually shied away from doing too many women's oriented things because she knew that everybody knew that was her expertise and she needed to establish expertise elsewhere. So gender is emphasized when it's helpful, it's de-emphasized when you're concerned that people will see it as showing you as having weakness.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you mainly look at the 107th and 108th Congress, and I wonder if you could just go through why you thought that 4-year span at the beginning of the last decade was really the time when you could most get the best information, or was that the time you thought you could get the best information about how women were achieving their policy goals?
Well, part of it was a matter of numbers. So there were very few women at all in the Senate, and you finally had enough women that you could say something about the impact that women as a group were having on Congress. And then policy-wise, it was a very interesting time because President George W. Bush came in as a compassionate conservative. People forget that once he becomes the 9/11 president.
Right.
But being a compassionate conservative, the first issues that he was emphasizing were what people consider to be traditional social welfare issues that a lot of people identify with.
No Child
women.
Left Behind obviously was a big deal the summer of 2001.
Absolutely. So No Child Left Behind was important. They did a Medicare prescription drug benefit, which was the largest expansion of Medicare since it was created.
Right.
And the biggest change in healthcare policy up until you have Obama's healthcare reform. Mm-hmm. So there were 2 big social welfare issues right there, but also there was a lot of action on social issues because for the first time you have Republicans in control of the presidency and both houses of Congress. So the Partial Birth Abortion Act was passed at this time. And President Bush had 2 nominees to the Supreme Court, and they really shift the balance of power in the court, particularly on issues of women's rights. So when you replace Sandra Day O'Connor with Samuel Alito, that had a big change on women's rights issues. So whereas the partial birth abortion ban was originally declared unconstitutional, and O'Connor was the swing vote there, then a couple of years later, very similar legislation is declared constitutional by the Roberts Court. And of course, you had the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act going through the Lilly Ledbetter case going through the courts at that time as
right.
well.
It seems to me that abortion has, sort of been an undercurrent for a lot of the issues that the Senate in general has to deal with because of, and not just in those 4 years that you take a real, deep dive at, but because of the Supreme Court and because of even court cases that are coming up now. We're expecting a lot of court cases on sexual assault in the military and whatnot. I wonder if you think how that has impacted how women sort of deal with these other issues, in terms of how they deal with Supreme Court nominees, for example.
Well, the research that I did, I was looking particularly at the replacement of Sandra Day O'Connor and how senators dealt with looking at her replacement. And in general, when you're talking about a Supreme Court nominee, if I'm of the president's party, I need to support the president's nominee. That's pretty much a given. So there were going to be cases where you had your more moderate Republican senators like Olympia Snowe and Susan Collins. They were going to be put in somewhat of an uncomfortable position because they espouse themselves as pro-choice senators, and they get a lot of electoral support there in Maine by being pro-choice. They get support from Democratic voters. But these were judges that would be coming up that would be ruling on those cases, and it was fairly clear that they would not be pro-choice judges, right, even though everyone says there's no litmus test. So they were going to have to navigate and negotiate that in terms of the timing of their announcements of support and what kind of questions they wanted to ask about. For the Democrats, there was a panoply of issues under which they were going to object to these, right, nominees. Issues of executive power, issues of business-labor relations. And what I found was that the women were much more likely to question about women's rights and to say in their statements that they were opposing them, not just on abortion, but particularly the Democratic women would go to other women's issues beyond abortion. Abortion is very much a litmus test to say I support women's rights, and it's the focal point of debate between the two parties. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of other issues of women's rights that people can look at, and it was the Democratic women that were more likely to bring up things like their position on equal pay, family leave. You know, there were some cases that Alito had ruled on in those areas, right, and these kinds of issues.
Well, do you think, though, that the Senate, women in the Senate have changed the debate over time, or are they still operating under sort of, and this specifically talking about abortion, are they still operating under sort of constructs that are largely created by male policymakers in terms of having to respond to appointees made by male presidents, and Republican men, as you point out, are more likely to sponsor quote-unquote anti-feminist bills, you know, and abortion bans and whatnot? Do you feel like, or is there room for them to sort of be more proactive in that realm?
I think it depends on the circumstance. So the institution itself, they need to follow the norms of the institution. Very recently, Democratic women have actually been leading, not on the issue of abortion necessarily, but on contraception. Mm-hmm. So I think that when you look at what's happened with President Obama's health care bill and the contraception mandate, a lot of that was driven by female Democratic senators. And what you see a lot of times is the female Democratic women getting together, they have press conferences, they write editorials, they go down to the floor to speak, they put pressure on the administration. So there was a point where the administration could have decided, okay, we'll carve out a lot of exceptions here for contraception coverage, particularly, say, for institutions that are religious institutions like Catholic universities. I work for Georgetown University, right, places like that, to have exception to not have to cover contraception. And the Democratic women were really pressing for this to be as broad as possible. And I think that they helped the administration, along with Kathleen Sebelius, mm-hmm, to stand their ground and have a fairly strict rule to make the coverage fairly expansive. And they have pressed that beyond, to make sure that the mandate stays in place. And then, of course, they do utilize it in politics. So it was a big, right, selling point for President Obama in his re-election campaign in 2012. So in that way, I do think that they can sometimes lead if public opinion is where they are and if they, right, can be seen as moving public opinion. So in general, when it comes to issues of reproductive rights, the public is generally more supportive of contraception than they are, say, of partial birth abortion or something like that.
Right, exactly. Well, and I wanted to talk to you primarily about about one chapter in your book you devote solely to defense and how women and their policy priorities on defense, which I thought was interesting because, as you point out, no one has really looked at this before. I mean, a lot of people have talked about how do women policymakers deal with women's policy or policy that directly impacts women or has more of a focus on women, like education and abortion and social services and stuff like that. And one of the points that you make that I think is somewhat conventional wisdom, but I still think it's true, is that women are seen as weaker on defense, and that they have to overcome, they have to prove themselves a little bit more than their male colleagues might. But still, you say that gender doesn't have very much influence on how women really approached legislating on defense policy, that it was a pretty straightforward in terms of what you term hard and soft, defense issues, the war and the weapons system